Good morning. Hello, welcome. Good morning and welcome to Bonhoeffer with Courage and Humility, a weekend of learning with the Reverend Dr. Mark Brocker. Whether you are right here with me right now in person or watching this recording after today, we are so glad that you are here. For those who would like to learn more about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's remarkable story and theological legacy, copies of a brief biography are available at the entrance table there by Pastor Robin. There are a bunch of other handouts too, so hopefully you picked those up and checked in when you arrived. We want to thank our event sponsors, and those include the Sunset Cluster of the Oregon Synod of the ELCA, which includes a handful of churches. It's Calvary Lutheran Church in Hillsboro, Christ the King in Tigard, Shepherd of the Valley in Beaverton, this church, St. Andrew Lutheran Beaverton, St. Matthew Lutheran Beaverton, Spirit of Grace in Beaverton, and McMinnville Cooperative Ministries, and our other sponsor, ecofaithrecovery.org. We also gratefully acknowledge the generous grant from the St. Matthew Lutheran Church Foundation, which is covering the cost of our presenter and the registration and administrative support that is provided by St. Matthew's office manager, Vicki Rolfe. So we're very grateful to the foundation for covering those costs. My name is Pastor Allison Bangford. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the lead pastor here at St. Andrew. I'm very happy to be hosting this morning workshop today, and I'm excited for the rest of the events throughout the weekend. We have bathrooms available right outside the back doors there. So if you go outside, first on your left will be a men's restroom, and then past the name tags, there will be the women's restroom. And then right when you go outside on the right, near the entrance to the kitchen is a gender-neutral, all-gender restroom, single-stall restroom. So if you would like to use that, that's to your right out there. We have lots of refreshments. We have muffins and cheese and fruit, as well as a plate of gluten-free pastry bread type thing. And then we have coffee, etc. And so I want to thank Pastor Rachel Kramer from Calvary Lutheran for providing the food today. And we also want to thank some St. Andrew folks, Pam Farr for doing the coffee setup. We like to have our coffee in the morning. And Paul Navarre for doing the video recording. So thanks to all those folks. Oh, thank you. Because of the generosity of the St. Matthew Foundation and all the host congregations and organizations that I already named, all the costs for this weekend are already covered. So this allows any donations that you make to directly benefit the refugee services provided by Lutheran Community Services Northwest. So for those of us in person, you can use the QR code that's available at that table in the back by Pastor Robin, or you can give cash donation in the basket there. You can write a check out to Lutheran Community Services Northwest. If you are online, you should have received a link to donate online if you registered, then you will receive a link to donate online. So all of those donations go 100% to Lutheran Community Services Northwest to do refugee services that they provide. If you did register in advance or on site when you came in today, you will receive links to all the recordings from the whole weekend, and that includes today's presentation. Even though today is not being live streamed, this morning is not being live streamed, the rest of the events are being live streamed, but we are recording this morning, so all the recordings will be available to you. And you will also find out how much we were able to raise for Lutheran Community Services Northwest through this weekend event. At this time, I'd like to invite Pastor Robin Hartwig from Eco Faith Recovery, as well as from Spirit of Grace Lutheran Church, forward.
Thank you so much, Pastor Allison, and thank you to St. Andrew Lutheran Church. When the possibility of offering this opportunity to learn more about the witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, every single one of the pastors in the Sunset Cluster, the leaders of Eco-Faith Recovery said, yes, of course, we need this for a time like this. And Pastor Allison immediately jumped forward and said, we can host the workshop at St. Andrew. So special thank you to St. Andrew for hosting this event, and we'll thank the other churches for hosting the other events. Do keep in mind, if you're attending all of the events, they are at different locations, not right here. So make sure you know where you're going for this evening's public lecture at 7 p.m., which will be at St. Matthew. And there is a worship service also with Dr. Brocker and a forum tomorrow morning at Shepherd of the Valley Lutheran Church in Beaverton, and you are more than welcome to attend those as well. See the table in the back if you weren't signed up for those, but you want to change your mind and go ahead and attend. As already mentioned, thank you to all of the host congregations and Eco-Faith for offering staffing and material support to cover all those costs so that we can donate to services benefiting refugees and immigrants. When we asked Lutheran Community Services Northwest where their greatest area of need was, they said, rental assistance across the board. Besides the newly arrived special immigrant visa families, formerly stable Ukrainians are unable to pay rent due to delays in employment authorization document renewals. And the newest issue, commercial driver's licenses being suspended because drivers need to take an English test. How many of you have heard direct stories of people, immigrants and refugees, who are in need of material support right now in order to cover basic expenses? Yeah, a lot of us parish pastors are having more requests to help with that as well. So please join me in giving as generously as you can to help meet this critical need. If you give at the QR code or through the basket today, our combined donations, they're going to let us know how much that is. They've got a special landing page for us. And if you're like me, if you can feel like, oh, does my individual contribution even make any difference in light of all the needs right now? Well, this is a way to collectively see what we can do together. And we will, if you are signed up, we will make sure you get an email that tells you what our collective impact was in terms of meeting this vital need. And now it's a distinct honor for me to introduce the Reverend Dr. Mark Brocker, a leading interpreter of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life and theology, a dear colleague of mine and many of the rest of you. Some of you know Dr. Brocker through being Pastor Brocker, your own pastor at St. Andrew or another faith community in the past. Dr. Brocker currently serves as theologian in residence with St. Luke Lutheran Church and previously led St. Andrew Lutheran Church in Beaverton for nearly 2 decades. He was the editor of Conspiracy and Imprisonment, 1940 to 1945, volume 16 of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works, and served as president of the International Bonhoeffer Society English Language Section. With both pastoral and academic depth, Dr. Brocker brings a rare gift for connecting Bonhoeffer's resistance, faith, and ethics to the challenges we face in our own time. Please join me in warmly welcoming the Reverend Dr. Mark Brocker.
Well, thank you, Pastor Robin, for that kind introduction. Pastor Robin's also been serving as a Zoom master for the 6-week class we had, just introducing people to Life Together, Bonhoeffer's volume Life Together. I've never been treated with so much respect by Pastor Robin. She's been reverend doctoring me for the last 6 weeks, but I do appreciate it. And of course, I enjoyed 11 years of working with Pastor Robin here at St. Andrew, and so it's good to be working with her once again. I do also want to thank the Sunset Cluster and Eco-Faith Recovery for sponsoring this event. Thank you to St. Andrew for hosting this workshop. It's encouraging to be invited back to teach or preach in a congregation you were at formerly, so I was glad to be able to come back here. And there's another story. I got a call earlier in the week from Carol Harker, the parish manager, and said the heat's out in the fellowship hall. It's a workshop, so people be working around tables. Of course, well, what can we do? They said, well, we'll have to move into the sanctuary probably was the only solution, which we'd have made work. But and then when I saw her name pop up on my phone a couple of days ago, I thought, you know what, I bet you this might even be good news. And sure enough, rather than replace the whole system, it turned out to be a bird's nest was the problem. And so sometimes, we need to get along with God's creatures, but sometimes we don't quite get along on certain things like that. So, the theme for this morning for the workshop with courage and humility, Bonhoeffer's ethical approach for us today, that's the title of a book that will be published by Fortress in 2026. I'm almost to the point of turning in the manuscript for that. So you're part of the process of bringing that book into fruition. So I just wanted to let you know that, and I've benefited in a variety of ways from things I've done in the past several years that are leading to that book. What I want you to do just for 5 minutes here is to, at your table groups, and you'll have to decide if you want to join with another table so you have more people. It's up to you on how you want to do that. For some of you who only have 2 or 3. Simple question, what brings you to this Bonhoeffer ethics workshop? Brief answer, share it with one another. I think it'd be interesting for people to hear what brings you. And it may be the most mundane reason ever, or it may be something that you've been struggling with, whatever that is that brought you here this morning. And this is to prime the pump for what I'll be presenting. So give you 5 minutes or so. Well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is probably best known for his bold, courageous involvement in the conspiracy against Adolf Hitler. But I think he's especially relevant for us today. What is relevant for us today is how he combines in his ethical approach both courage and humility. And not only in an extraordinary time like was when he was involved in the conspiracy, but also in ordinary times. We need to be courageous enough. By the way, you have a detailed outline there, and I give this to you. This is what I work from. If it's helpful for you to follow along on that, great. If not, you'll have it as notes to take from the workshop. We need to be courageous enough to engage in responsible action when compelled by the concrete situation that we're in, but we also need to be humble enough to let God be the ultimate judge of our actions. We need to trust that God will carry forward what needs to be carried forward and leave behind what needs to be left behind. I want to focus on what I call Bonhoeffer's appeal for ethical humility. This is grounded in what we might call a miracle of divine mercy. God's deep love for the world is the firm theological ground for Bonhoeffer's ethical approach. Bonhoeffer and other leaders in Germany grieved the destructive path that Hitler and his Nazi cohorts were leading the nation down. In the midst of the carnage of World War II and the Holocaust, Bonhoeffer affirmed that the central message of the New Testament is that in Christ God has loved the world and reconciled it with himself. God loves the real world, and the real world is the lost and condemned world, he says. And he calls this a miracle of divine mercy. Quotation from Ethics where he says, no part of the world, no matter how lost, no matter how godless, it has not been accepted by God in Jesus Christ and reconciled to God. The focus of ethics then for Bonhoeffer is to participate in this divine miracle. God's self-revelation in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus teaches us to love as God first loved us. Bonhoeffer was confident that even flawed human beings can participate into what he refers to as Christ's greatness of heart. The focus of ethics for Bonhoeffer is on discerning the will of God. What's God calling us to do in this time and place? It's not, he said, how can I be good or how can I do something good, which is the tendency we have is we want to know we're doing the right thing or a good thing. But he said this is a futile attempt to justify ourselves. And so the key question, he writes at the beginning of Ethics, is what is the will of God? He lifts up the example of Adam and Eve and their futile attempt to secure the knowledge of good and evil. You think of Genesis 3, 1 through 7, where they're not satisfied with God being the one who knows good and evil. They wanted to be like God, knowing good and evil. And having certain knowledge of good and evil. So Adam and Eve refused to accept their human limits, and this is an example of lacking ethical humility. Bonhoeffer affirms that the will of God is already fulfilled in the miracle of divine mercy, and so the focus of ethics becomes to participate in this fulfilled will of God. We might refer to it as God's deep love for the world is realized among us. It's made real in and through us. For Bonhoeffer, discerning the will of God is an ongoing process. The will of God does not naturally imprint itself on the heart, says Bonhoeffer. It may be deeply hidden in many competing possibilities. It may be new and different in each given situation. That means that heart, intellect, observation, and experience all have a role to play in the discernment process. He said we need an intensely sober attitude that employs the full range of human abilities. You might say that in full range of human knowledge. So you think of all the disciplines and so on. He's very focused on who Christ is and following Christ. At the same time, he recognizes that we can learn from so many different people when it comes to looking at an actual situation we find ourselves involved in. Bonhoeffer speaks of engaging in responsible action. It entails participating in the realization of the will of God, and we do that by engaging in responsible action. He defines responsible action as action on behalf of or in the place of others without expectation of return. Ethical humility is built into the structure of the responsible life. Responsible persons are free to live and make decisions, but that freedom is conditioned by our obligation to God and neighbor. And clearly he's influenced both by Paul, Galatians 5:13, but also by Luther. Luther had talk about the freedom of a Christian, a famous essay Luther wrote, and Luther talks about how we're both free and obligated, or we're servants of others, as well as being free then to make decisions. Bonhoeffer identifies Jesus as the responsible person par excellence. Jesus gave himself completely on behalf of others. He demonstrated ethical humility by taking the guilt of all human beings upon himself and by dying a humiliating death on the cross. Jesus did not shun the guilt of other human beings, did not try to separate himself from the guilt of other human beings. He talks about, Bonhoeffer says, to seek to maintain personal innocence in our lives cuts us off from Jesus. Real innocence, he says, is a willingness to enter into what's the community of guilt. He also affirms that when it comes to responsible action, we cannot have absolute or certain knowledge of history. The ethical task is to do our homework and discern the will of God as best we can. Doing that homework entails consideration of a full matrix of ethical factors, motives, consequences, values, general and human conditions, principles, and so on. That does not mean we can settle for ethical shortcuts, and we'll talk more about that. Bonhoeffer critiques any partial response approaches to ethics, and so he distinguishes his ethics of responsibility. The big long word I learned in my class at PLU is teleological ethics, where the focus is on consequences. And then we learned about deontological ethics, again, big word, but we're talking about motives. And so any ethic that just focuses on consequences or just focuses on motives is too narrow an ethic. Bonhoeffer wants to move us toward a comprehensive ethics of responsibility which takes into account consequences, motives, and the whole array of ethical factors. There is no foolproof rule for action for us to hide behind. The ethical task for human beings, that's part of being human, is to engage in dealing with ethical issues that may not be black and white, but have shades of gray in them. Finally, we observe, judge, not ultimate judgment, but we do judge, weigh, decide, and act. Now, I do want to address, I think, Bonhoeffer's involvement in the conspiracy as a case study in ethical courage and humility, so I do want to spend a little time talking about that particular case that he lived out. His involvement in the conspiracy against Hitler is what he referred to as an extraordinary situation of ultimate necessities. Now, when he wrote his ethics, he doesn't mention Hitler by name in there. That's just not something you do when you're involved in a conspiracy. So just his boldness and courage in getting involved are compelling, and certainly have been compelling for many. And his sacrifice of his life has been a powerful witness of ever since, and it's certainly in our time also. It's striking that Bonhoeffer himself sought to avoid justifying his actions. In fact, he would have accepted the charge that his response may have been a tardy one, and not only his response, but the response of the conspirators. They may have waited too long to take action. It was one thing, he said, to give an account of his actions, but another thing to justify those actions. And for him to try to justify what they were doing, I mean, they were still trying to murder somebody. So he said, this is not just a clear-cut case, and that would be an example of ethical arrogance when you try to justify, if he'd have tried to justify his actions. The responsible position, according to Bonhoeffer, was not to take this justification into his own hands before, during, and after his actions. And Eberhard Bethge, who knew him best, his confessing partner, friend, biographer, and so on, really emphasized that in his biography of Bonhoeffer, which, by the way, it's the big biography, 1,000 pages. If you're really interested in reading biography, I do know of some good shorter ones than that. Only God could ultimately judge his actions. Bonhoeffer felt compelled to act as he did, but only with a profound sense of ethical humility. Now, we want to resist the temptation for this extraordinary responsible action to be the measure of all action. And Bonhoeffer himself says we do not have to be like Hercules standing in perpetuity at a crossroads, struggling forever to make the right decision, someone worn out by conflicting duties again and again, failing and starting anew. He says we're free to be human before God, eating, drinking, sleeping, working, and playing without interrupting those activities. We don't have to question if we're permitted to sleep and eat and work and play. We don't have to question, all the time if we have something more urgent we should be doing. Just a practical way. So, for example, if you're a school teacher or a nurse, let's say, you just be the nurse for the day. Do what you do as a nurse, or if you're a teacher, you do what you do. You teach for the day. And you don't have to psych out every little decision you make during the day doing this. And so he wanted to say there are situations where we'd have to wrestle with it because a tough decision needs to be made, but we're also free just to be the human beings that we are created to be. He does talk about divinely commissioned tasks. He used the term mandates. When I teach ethics, I like to talk about responsibilities and also abilities to respond. But mandates was the term he used in his ethics. And he identified 4: work, marriage, government, and church. And so, for example, responsible parents act on behalf of or in the place of their children. Responsible law enforcement officers would act on behalf of the citizens of a community. And this is certainly a time and a place to evaluate how we're doing in fulfilling the mandates. But again, it's not like we're psyching out every little thing we do when we're fulfilling those responsibilities. In the more ordinary flow of life, God does not want us to engage in, quote, this self-tormenting and hopeless question about the purity of one's motives, suspicious self-observation, and the blazing and wearisome light of ceaseless conscious awareness. He said it in German, but it's pretty interesting quotation in English too. That's the team that worked on ethics got that quotation right, I believe. He does say, but there are exceptional moments of crisis. And in such exceptional moments, there's no law to hide behind. One must decide as what he calls a free venture. We may need to acknowledge that the law is being broken. A commandment may need to be broken out of dire necessity. We need to surrender the decision and action to the divine guidance of history. So Bonhoeffer knew he was committing treason, and he was in fact breaking the law. Now we might look back on that and commend him for what he did, but in fact at the time he was committing treason. Finally he reached a point where he saw no other options to stop the catastrophe perpetrated by Hitler and the Nazis. And he was willing to even put his life and reputation on the line. I want to tell you a story. So Robert Erickson was a history professor at Pacific Lutheran University. And I had a chance to talk with him when I served Trinity Lutheran up in Tacoma, which is right by PLU. I had a chance to talk with him. He was working on a documentary on theologians under Hitler. And Erickson had done his doctoral thesis on theologians under Hitler. Bonhoeffer was not one of the three he focused on, but he certainly was aware of Bonhoeffer. Anyway, he had a fellow graduate student who was from Germany. And this graduate student said, when you go over to Germany, you should talk with my parents. They live in a small village in Germany. They were not part of the Nazi party, but you might be interested in their perspective on things. So when he went over there, he did, and of course they were very gracious and welcomed him and glad to be talking to one of their son's fellow graduate students. And they wanted to know what he was working on, and he said, well, I'm working on this, Theologians under Hitler. And in the course of the conversation, Bonhoeffer's name came up, and they went silent. And he realized that they still viewed him as a traitor to the German nation. This is almost 25 years after he had been executed. I think that was, when I first heard that story, that really was an eye-opener for me. What was at stake by getting involved in that conspiracy, whatever we think of Hitler and the Nazis. Finally then, when we approach ethics in the way Bonhoeffer did, we need to let our gracious God be the judge. We can count on God's love through the whole process. The ultimate judge of our actions is a God who loves us, a God who loves us. We're aware that in discerning the will of God and engaging in responsible action, human beings have a limited point of view in history. And there's a wonderful quotation again from Bonhoeffer. Responsible action takes place in the sphere of relativity, completely shrouded in the twilight that the historical situation casts upon good and evil. It takes place in the midst of the countless perspectives from which every phenomenon is seen. Responsible action must decide not simply between right and wrong and good and evil, but between right and wrong and wrong. My sense is he doesn't come right out and say it in his ethics again. He's got to be careful what he's putting in there in case it gets read by the wrong people, so to speak. But I think he viewed getting involved in the conspiracy as your two bad options. I mean, this is neither option was good. Letting Hitler and the Nazis continue doing what they're doing, but then having to murder the head of state, he didn't view either of those as good options. A thorough discernment process frees us then to make real decisions. The divine will is accomplished through our discernment, decision-making, and acting. And then Bonhoeffer makes a striking comment. He says, God can even work with irresponsible actions. And he lifts up the example of Judas. And so in one way, that takes some of the pressure off of us, I think. If we do our ethical homework, we discern the best we can, and finally we have the courage to take action, knowing that God somehow will, even if we don't get it right, so to speak, that God can somehow use that action. We can give up then anxiety about our own goodness, certainty of what is good and what is evil, especially in these difficult issues, when we're wrestling with a difficult issue. And we also can give up the ultimate justification of what we have done. Finally, the important thing is God loves us still, even as we make our decisions. Not that I'm a good person or I did a good thing. That's just not the focus. It's a God who loves us, and we're doing our best to participate in that love. We can let our gracious God be the judge, and an essential characteristic of responsible action is the ultimate ignorance of one's own goodness or evil and our dependence on God's grace. And we do not appeal to one fundamental moral principle or an ideology or some other moral factor to justify our actions. He was Lutheran by background. He also was very much familiar with the Reformed tradition. You know, we have the Presbyterians came out of the Reformed tradition and so on. But that notice for him in his ethics, where we talk about being justified by grace through faith in our Lutheran tradition. And so what's the opposite of that? Self-justification. And it's not surprising that would focus his ethics and his ethical approach. So once we have done our ethical homework, made a decision, and acted, we surrender our actions to God the moment it is carried out. We willingly take on any guilt, but do not wallow in the guilt. Once responsible action is carried out, we need a humble, hope-filled trust that God will make the divine will known. One of the profound mysteries of history, then, he says, is precisely those who act in the freedom of their very own responsibility. See their activity as flowing into God's guidance. Free action recognizes itself ultimately as God's action. Decision is God's guidance. The venture is divine necessity. In freely surrendering the knowledge of our own goodness, the good of God occurs. And so we are called to be courageous enough to engage in responsible action and humble enough to let God, our gracious God, be the judge of our actions. God's love is not contingent on us getting everything right. We need to trust that the God who judges our action is the God who loves us. And finally, Bonhoeffer's ethical approach for us today, some key insights. We may need a red flag political warning. And I actually, when I first wrote this, it was a while back, so if anything, we're even more in a situation like this. Pacific Northwest, we're highly alert to red flag warnings. A red flag warning means conditions are right for extreme fire weather in the next 24 hours. High temperatures, low humidity, strong winds, one spark can ignite a highly destructive fire. Do we need to issue a red flag political warning? Now, I grew up during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War years. Our nation was struggling with deep political and social divisions during that time. But I've never experienced a nation as divided as it is today. This is as divided as I've ever seen it. Prominent historians have said that we're more divided than at any time since the Civil War. Conditions seem right for extreme and destructive political behavior, and it doesn't take much to trigger a political conflagration. One major factor in this is the lack of ethical humility among so many American citizens. The appeal for ethical humility calls into question those who are too certain of their own ethical goodness or rightness. Cautions followers of Jesus who are overly confident in their ability to discern the will of God. There's a tendency for Christians in the United States to occupy what Bonhoeffer refers to as the proud throne of the judge, where you kind of stand outside and look down and pronounce judgments on things. Can't do that because we're right in the middle of it. See, we don't get to remove ourselves to a throne and look down upon things. Once again, Bonhoeffer encourages followers of Jesus to act with boldness and courage, but always at the same time with a strong dose of ethical humility. We need to recognize extraordinary, unprecedented aspects of our current situation, but at the same time need to continue to fulfill more ordinary responsibilities. We need to profess as well as protest. So we do need protests, I think, and we had the No, maybe some of you participated in the No Kings rally that was last Saturday, right? Full confession, I was coaching my granddaughter's volleyball team. And I was supposed to be coaching that volleyball team this morning also, so I didn't want to go 2 weeks in a row. So that's one of those ethical case studies that I had to deal with right there. But I'm glad there are people willing to engage in protest when they see something that they think needs to be protested against. At the same time, we also, especially as followers of Jesus and people of faith, need to say, what is it we are professing? What is the vision that we are setting before people, and what does it mean to live out that vision? I do believe we need to engage in our time in the equivalent of a full court press. So I don't know how many of you are basketball fans, but when I was in high school, our team, my senior year, I never started, but I played on the team. And it was really clear at the beginning of the year we weren't going to score many points. And so the coach was real blunt with it. He says, the only way we're going to win any games is to play defense the whole court, the whole game. And so we were relentless, practicing defense and playing defense. And the school had never had a great basketball team. Most any team had ever won was 10 games. But we ended up winning 10 games just doing exactly that. And he even made the guys that didn't start, like me, he said, and you guys need to work those starters in practice as hard as you can. That's my image right now. We need people in various ways doing what they can to resist things that need to be resisted. And I'll just one example for me, and I'll mention him again tonight. For example, if you're a senator in the U.S. Senate, I think Senator Merkley going 22 hours on the floor, almost a desperation measure, but that's an example of a full court press doing that kind of thing. I have referred to Bonhoeffer's grandmother, and I will refer to her repeatedly through the weekend, 91 years old, and the Nazis have a boycott of Jewish businesses. This is April 1st, 1933, 2 months after they came to power. And she said, I'm going to shop where I usually shop. And she walked right through a cordon of Nazi soldiers, right into this main department store in Berlin, which was owned by a Jewish family, did her shopping. I have no idea if she bought anything at all, but she was bound and determined she was going to shop on that day. And then she walked out right through those soldiers. There's no way those young soldiers were going to stop a 91-year-old grandmother at that point. But notice example, she was resisting by shopping. She was resisting by shopping. We need protesting. We need a Senator Merkley to do what he was doing, and we need somebody like Bonhoeffer's grandma doing that kind of thing, finding a way to resist right in the flow of her daily life. We do need to learn to live within our ecological limits. For Bonhoeffer, the overwhelming crisis was the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. He was appalled by the prevailing silence of the church and weak response, especially by the leaders. He wanted to hear something from the leaders of the church. And Bonhoeffer was not a bishop or anything like that. We need to remember, yes, he had a role in the church there, but he was not. He wanted to hear it from the leaders. The response to Kristallnacht, this is where in November 9th, 1938, Nazis went wild in Germany, desecrating synagogues, vandalizing them, Jewish businesses, and so on. There was no public response to that by the church. Excuse me, I'm going to grab a drink here. Bonhoeffer's involvement in this conspiracy against Hitler was a desperate response. The overwhelming crisis of our time is the impending ecological catastrophe. And I would still say that even with what we're struggling with in the political and public realm right now, that is the overwhelming catastrophe that's coming upon us, and that's a worldwide thing. That's a global thing. Now, my tendency is to prefer incremental change. I've always tended to function that way. I think the problem with incremental change when you're dealing with something like a potential ecological catastrophe is it may not be adequate. And it's extremely hard, even for those who are very concerned about the environment and so on. When it comes to changing your way of life in the ways we may need to do it, even though it could eventually would lead to flourishing life, it is very difficult to change a way of life, and that is a real challenge we're up against, I think, in our time. Silence on this issue and a failure to act boldly and courageously is likely to have catastrophic consequences for the whole beloved earth community. Those who profess to follow Jesus have opened ourselves to the charge that what we have done thus far is not a good response, but a very tardy one. One key factor is our lack of humility as human beings. We've resisted our God-given limits. God intends these limits for our well-being and the well-being of the whole earth community. We cannot violate these God-given limits with impunity if we are to responsibly address ecological issues and crises. In our given national political climate, we may need to act locally and globally if we can operate nationally. So one example of that is right now there is a move to amend the Oregon Constitution to lift up a natural right to a healthy environment, basically, is what it's about. That's something we can work on here in Oregon that can have an impact even beyond Oregon. But it's an example of something we can do, even if there's things we can't do at a national level, or even if we're going backwards at a national level. In terms of the path forward then, final remarks, knowing that the judge of our actions is our gracious God who loves us, Bonhoeffer asserts to his fellow conspirators, and after 10 years, written in Christmas time, 1942, about 10 years after Hitler came to power, several months before Bonhoeffer is arrested and imprisoned. In there, he accepts that we need to accept co-responsibility for history, is how he refers to it. He dismisses the notion of going down heroically, convinced of our own goodness. That isn't adequate to the time and place, he thought. That is actually non-heroic because it does not dare look into the future. The ultimately responsible question, he says, is how will the next generation go on living? We need to trust that the God who loves us dearly will judge our responses, and that God will carry forward what needs to be carried forward and leave behind what needs to be left behind. And then he adds a final insight. Listen to the younger generation. Their future is at stake. And I just want to add one more comment here. So I did a presentation like this up in Wenatchee at Grace Lutheran back last year, 2024. And I added, this is Bonhoeffer's insight about listening to the younger generation. I got more pushback on that than any other. One guy just literally got up and said, "You expect me to listen to the younger generation?" And he was almost irate with me. I mean, that I would even dare. And he was not the only one, because I saw several heads nodding in agreement with him. Like, yeah. But his experience, for whatever reason, is you can't trust them, right? You can't trust that younger generation. But I think the younger generation is seeing some of the stuff that's going on, and so we need to find a way to pay attention to their insights that they have in our time. Well, that's my presentation. What I want to do now is, first of all, we're going to have a chance for you to ask where we're all listening in, but I want you at table groups. Make it simple. What insight or something from that presentation about Bonhoeffer's approach to ethics just grabbed your attention? Doesn't have to be profound. Just what was it that stood out for you? And then if you have a question or concern, something you heard that you're not quite sure about or you're wondering about, talk about that. We're going to give you about 15 minutes or so to talk at table groups, all right? Chance to come back. I'll just make a comment while people are regathering. In terms of when I said profess, not only protest, but profess, I think one of the challenges now is how do you make that, if it's hard to do it with words, how do you embody profession? So for example, the example was given of working on maybe sanctuary or working on so there's various ways that we can make it visible. How do we make it visible in a way that's, it's still not going to be perfectly safe from misinterpretation and all that, but what can we do to be as clear as possible when we are articulating our core values and living out our core values? So we're going to move into a case study. You should have a handout that just says responsible decision making. This is a test run for this. This is going into the book, I think. It's the plan anyway. And I used to have a one-page version of this, but now I've got these items, and I'll explain it, and with some commentary and explanation of them. I'll go through that. That'll take me about maybe 15 minutes or so. In effect, I'll be reading much of it, so you can follow along if you want or make little notes on it. The case, you should have something that says the case of the polarizing church property. So rather than deal with something here in the Portland metro area, we're going to look at something in Detroit. This is a case from Detroit, but I think you'll see why it's an interesting deal. And then you should have something where it's a worksheet that says responsible decision making, and that's for you to take notes as you're working on the case study. And so I'll explain more about how to use that. So what we'll do is I'll do this presentation on this case study method and responsible decision making. We'll at our table groups work on this case study for 15 to 20 minutes. It's very unlikely you're going to get the perfect answer in that time, but what I will almost guarantee you is that you'll feel like you have a better grasp of what the issues were in that case, even after just 15 or 20 minutes. And obviously you could have more time in a real life case study situation. You would have more time to work on it in all likelihood. And then we'll have about 15, 20 minutes to conclude where people can share from your table groups, things that came up, insights, and we'll do that in a larger group. So that's the strategy for this last hour. By the way, got the report. By the way, my volleyball team that I've been coaching was 0-4. After this morning, they're 0-5. But they almost won a game. They lost 25-23 in one of the games. So we're making progress. So then responsible decision making. So Bonhoeffer did not develop this responsible decision making method, but it has emerged from my study of his ethics of responsibility with an assist from Dr. Courtney Campbell of Oregon State University. At a spirituality and medical ethics event at Portland State University over 20 years ago, Dr. Campbell provided an ethics assessment handout. It was a one-page thing, which he gave me permission to tailor for my purposes. His was not, he was more of a philosopher in a sense, and so he gave me permission and I was able to tailor it with some theological type questions and items. The purpose of the following 12 items then is to encourage people consistent with Bonhoeffer's ethical approach. Again, this isn't his that he developed for us, so it's me based on his approach and others putting this together to take into account the full range of ethical factors involved in the decision making. So in the typical case study, one will not necessarily go through these items in the exact order that I'm going to present them, but it will be helpful in one way or another to attend to all 12. The responsible decision-making worksheet is intended to be a note-taking tool. You do not need to dwell on whether an ethical factor belongs in one category or the other. In fact, feel free to list an ethical factor in more than one category. In a decision-making process, the hope is that a particular course of action will emerge. Seldom, if ever, will you have complete certainty about the decision you made, if it is truly a difficult issue. But you can at least be confident that you've done your ethical homework in a responsible way and accept the consequences of your decision. Ultimately, as Bonhoeffer encourages us, we need to let God be the judge. As Bonhoeffer wrote to his fellow conspirators, he believed that even our mistakes and shortcomings are not in vain, and that it is no more difficult for God to deal with them than with our supposedly good deeds. Our focus is on taking the next necessary step. So just pause there. Sometimes we want to solve it all, and so Bonhoeffer was aware sometimes what we're really trying to do is figure out what's the next step to take, and we may not be able to discern what the ultimate step might be in some sense, but we take the next step. So number one thing is to clarify the facts of the case, and as a question came up in our conversation, is the given information reliable? It's really difficult to sift through this now, but we need to do it. What else do we need to know before making a decision? We may just not have enough information. Or you may need to call another person to come in and check the heating system and see what you might find out that helps make a decision on whether you want to spend $200 or $25,000 or $30,000. So an accurate is crucial in any decision making, especially when public leaders talk about alternative facts. As Bonhoeffer insists in his essay, What Does It Mean to Tell the Truth? That assessment will include serious consideration of intentions, perceptions, and the real circumstances of the case. We need to make sure we can depend on the sources of information. Is any key source of information likely to be unreliable? We also need to ask what we do not know yet that will help work towards a decision. What personal history or experiences do you bring to the case? All of us have history and experiences that can influence or even bias the way we engage in decision making on a particular case. For example, when I deal with any case related to the issue of abortion, I'm aware that my dad was the MC for a Right to Life rally on the steps of the Oregon Capitol on the day after the Roe versus Wade ruling in 1973. If a dear family member or friend of yours went through a difficult end-of-life experience, that could impact how you assess end-of-life case studies. That influence or impact could be constructive and not necessarily skew your ability to assess a case, but it may, and that is helpful to be aware of. A third item is to specify the ethical issue or issues the case presents. What is the decision that needs to be made? Be succinct. So much depends on the decision-making process on as clear a statement as possible of the issue or issues at stake. Sometimes the key issue is obvious right from the beginning. Other times, clarifying the issue or issues will take time as one explores the various factors involved. But one way or another, clarity on the issue or issues needs to emerge and be stated succinctly. Without this clarity, people can talk past each other, and confusion and frustration will result. Even when there is disagreement in a given case study, clarity on the exact disagreement is helpful. Fourth one is to lay out the options available to the decision makers and stakeholders. Often in a decision-making process, 2 or 3 options can be identified early on, but other times the decision makers or stakeholders may not be satisfied with any of the obvious options, and 1 or more other options may emerge. The most complicated cases tend to be those with multiple options. In such cases, it is essential, even if it is time-consuming, to work through each option. The easiest option may not be the best one to pursue. 5, who are the stakeholders and or decision makers in this case? And I just want to say on this first question, how is power distributed among them? When I first started using something like this case study method, the power question wasn't part of it. And so I needed to, somewhere along the way, somebody woke me up to the importance of asking that power question when we're looking at a particular issue or case. So whose voices are being heard and whose voices are being ignored? And I would say even now we're even talking, in terms of ecological issues and environmental issues, creatures, who's the voice for the creatures? So this is, even something like that, it's not only human beings that may not be listened to, it could be other creatures that are not being listened to on certain issues. The stakeholders and or decision makers in a given situation may be obvious, but often there are stakeholders or decision makers who are not taken into consideration. They need to be identified and taken into account, and that it is important to address the power dynamics among all those most invested in the decision to be made. In many cases, the voices of the vulnerable and the weak, who tend to bear the brunt of destructive decisions, are neglected or ignored. Number 6, identify key norms, principles, themes, and values from the Christian tradition and other sources relevant to the case. For followers of Jesus, key norms, principles, themes, and values are to be taken into account. For example, in our Christian tradition, 2 core values are love of God and love of neighbor. We share those core values with the Jewish tradition. For someone in the Buddhist tradition, compassion would be a core value. And given the urgency of the ecological crises before us, love of creation is another core value to be identified and lifted up. The golden rule, you should love your neighbor as yourself, implies that love of self, properly understood, is also a core value. Even if someone claims no faith tradition, we can share norms such as justice and the rule of law with them. Being responsible is not a uniquely Christian virtue. Exploring the full range of norms, principles, themes, and values is crucial to sorting out what is at stake in the decision-making process. Number 7, examine the motives of the stakeholders and decision makers. Examining the motives of stakeholders and decision makers can shed light on a particular case study. For example, a politician may be especially concerned about winning the next election, or a business person may be most concerned about the profit margin. Or someone could be so concerned about the purity of our motives that they close themselves off from what might be the best course of action in a less than clear situation. The goal of examining motives is to make sure that no one motive be given too much weight in the decision-making process. Motives are an important ethical factor, but only one ethical factor. Number 8, envision probable outcomes or consequences of the various options. To what extent does an outcome depend on the cooperation of others? You may have a great idea of the outcome you'd like to see, but is it possible that it'll even happen if people don't cooperate? Will the most pressing needs of the stakeholders be met? And then are any of the means to achieve an outcome questionable? When we seek to envision probable outcomes, a certain measure of ethical humility is necessary. As Bonhoeffer asserts, we have a limited point of view in history. Our ability to predict the future will be limited. Nonetheless, a key part of our ethical homework is to make educated assessments of the anticipated consequences of the options under consideration. We may have a desired outcome, but that outcome may depend on a level of cooperation that is not likely to be achieved. We are not to assume that the ends justify the means. Number 9, consider how each option fits with various roles and responsibilities in life. What role conflicts will likely emerge? Will the ability to fulfill each responsibility be hindered or enhanced? This step could be viewed as a vocational assessment. Our various roles and responsibilities can work together in a given situation, but conflicts can emerge. So, for example, Martin Luther King Jr.'s crucial role in leading the civil rights movement conflicted with his role as a husband and a father. His family paid a terrible price, no matter how proud they may have been of him. Bonhoeffer had serious reservations about getting married because of the role he played in the church struggle and in a conspiracy against Hitler. By the way, he did get engaged 1 month before he was arrested, so he never did get married, but he almost married somebody in the 30s, but just was very concerned about what might happen to him, and so chose not, at least that's my understanding. I may not know the whole story, but and we never. This step then encourages us to at least assess how each option will impact and be impacted by our roles and responsibilities. And finally, decide which option seems more compelling. No easy shortcuts. And again, we're talking about those issues that are just the most challenging issues we tend to face. Once we've done our ethical homework as thoroughly as possible and have considered the full range of ethical factors, it is essential to decide which option seems more compelling. The point is not to have absolute certainty. In some of the more challenging cases, we may, as Bonhoeffer wrote, be deciding between right and right or wrong and wrong. Even the timing of making a decision is part of the process. And I just might add to that, one thing about voting is there is a voting day, although in Oregon it's a voting 3 weeks, I think it is. And so, but deciding whether you're going to vote at the beginning of that 3 weeks or toward the end of that 3 weeks, that's all part of the process, but it does help to have a day where the voting ends. Some issues are tough because there's no exact timeline for when you need to make the decision. And so you could go on for a long, long time just saying, is this the time to make the decision? Do we need more information? All that's part of the process. What I'm getting at here is there's a reason difficult ethical issues are challenging. It's because they're challenging. But as human beings, that's part of being a human being, is to be willing to engage in these difficult issues. It's part of our responsibility as human beings is to engage in those. And then last, the comment, we can use ethical shortcuts to justify ourselves or to avoid the necessary ethical work that needs to be done. Then number 11, this is something that I ended up adding to Courtney Campbell's list, was what I call do an ethical reality check. If you think, I think we're coming to an option, or I'm coming to an option to act on, one is, can the decision made actually be implemented? Again, it may seem like a great decision, but can it actually be implemented? Does the decision encourage individual and corporate responsibility in relation to God, other human beings, and today I think we're far more aware we need to pay attention to what the creation and our interconnection with other creatures also. Has any norm been given too much sway in this decision? And it may be a good norm, but is there some other norms that need to be taken into account? Have the needs and concerns of all stakeholders been taken into account? And then this one, are you too sure of the decision? If it's a tough issue, Bonhoeffer warned about even zealots of the truth. Sometimes if somebody's too sure about something, it could be a sign. It could be that they've just have the clarity on it, but it also could be they haven't done their enough homework yet on it. So again, that's part of that ethical reality check. Does the decision cohere with our vision of the individual and corporate form of Jesus Christ in the world? who we understand Jesus to be. Bonhoeffer had that image of Jesus as the responsible person par excellence. What's the image, what's the image we have? Each one of us has some portrait of Jesus. Gospel writers give us each a portrait of who Jesus was and what that means. What is our portrait of Jesus? I think each of us has one. And then our portrait of who the church is, and so on. So that's part of taking that into account. Having arrived at a decision, it is good to do what might be called an ethical reality check. If possible, it might be a good idea to take a break or to pause the decision-making process and then engage in this ethical reality check. My strategy for buying a new car has been to sleep on a decision to buy overnight and then follow through on signing documents the next day. And there's a dealer in Newburgh who, back when I was pastor in McMinnville in the 90s, who probably still can't believe that I didn't buy that Toyota truck he wanted to sell me. And he just thought it was perfect. And I really wanted to get that truck, great fishing truck and so on, and I did not get it. And actually was glad I didn't get it eventually, so I made the right decision there. We do well to approach major purchases in our lives as ethical case studies. 6 questions are listed above as part of an ethical reality check. You may have other questions to ask. The key is to test the decisions we make and to leave no ethical stone unturned. And we're not going to be perfect at this, obviously, but this is just, again, it's part of doing our homework on these challenging issues we face in our personal lives, in the life of a community, in the life of a state or a nation, that we try to leave no ethical stone unturned. And then another one I added was recommendations for implementation. Sometimes you come to a decision, but how are we actually going to do this? And once we've arrived at a decision and a course of action, it is helpful to spend some time coming up with recommendations for implementing the decision. Who will be responsible for making the decision happen? What steps need to be taken? What resources will be necessary? What will be key roadblocks? And so on. So I wanted to run that through for you. I obviously, the bold parts, those are the specific items. Again, don't worry about going 1 through 12. That may work, but this is meant to help you as you do your homework. I would work mainly on the worksheet you have in front of you and to take notes. Don't worry about, again, putting it in the right category. So you're going to want to read the case of the polarizing church property. It's just a couple of paragraphs, 3 paragraphs there to read up on it. And then discuss at your tables this case, following this, and see what clarity may emerge, what questions you have, and then we'll come back together and listen for input from people on this case study. So this is Executor Acres Covenant Church, and the explanations there. And again, one question's, you can also raise, we don't know this, and that would really help in this case. That may be something you're identifying as you go through this case study also. But see how far you can get, 15 to 20 minutes here. Challenging issues is to just get people thinking of more ethical factors than we might normally do. So and you can see already, I think, we've done this for 40 minutes, and you can see how we've considered things. And I've heard things today that in other times I've done this case study I haven't heard before. So and that's been my experience with that. So I hope that it helps. That's part of the reason for this. I don't know that I've formally used it ever at St. Andrew in a council meeting or for a decision, but when I'm making comments in a council meeting over the years, if people haven't noticed, if something just isn't even being thought of, I might just throw something out. So it's kind of like this is in the back of my mind. And in my other experiences, people on the toughest issues, people tend to do something like this, is try to think of all the different things to try to make a decision on a tough decision. And so in a way, it's not that unusual on tough issues. We just need to support people if they say, I got to get it right, or I need to be absolutely sure I'm doing the right thing. That's what tends to shortchange us. And then we need to support people when they make tough decisions. And as followers of Jesus, we're going to assure them that we're doing this in the presence of a God who loves us, finally. And even if we don't get it right, God can work with our decisions and our discernment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Doctor. We're so happy to have you here. And a reminder to everyone that if you would like to come to the lecture this evening, that's at St. Matthew Lutheran Church, also in Beaverton, and that is at 7 p.m. And we also have Pastor Mark preaching tomorrow morning at Shepherd of the Valley, and that is at 10 a.m., followed by an adult forum. So everyone's invited to all those things. If you'd like to make a donation on your way out, we would love that. You can leave cash or a check, and all that goes to, as we said, Lutheran Community Services. We want to thank Robin for being the person who had the idea for this whole weekend event, and so thank you. She was the initial spark that got more people involved and all the churches connected and getting this going. So thank you all for coming, and we will, one more time, thank you, Pastor Mark.
All right.